Greetings. I'm Mark Kennedy, Director of the Wahba Institute of Strategic Competition at the Wilson Center. We at the Wilson Center recently held a Maritime Conference roundtable in Miami with the World Trade Center of Miami and the Port of Miami. And we explored maritime commerce and its importance both from a trade as well as connecting around the world. We're thrilled to have with me today both Cary Davis of the American Association of Port Authorities, who was at the event, as well as Emily Feenstra from the American Society of Civil Engineers, whose organization was also represented at the event. We're going to have a great conversation to explore some of the findings of that roundtable. Emily, we'll start with you. Like so many aspects of commerce, the importance of maritime commerce and how it affects our economy is not well understood. Could you maybe share with us just how important maritime commerce, the transportation system, underpins the economy of our nation and the world?
Sure. Thanks, Mark, for the question and for including me and ASCE in this conversation. So absolutely, I think, supply chain probably entered mainstream conversation for the first time, right, during the pandemic, and ports have kind of risen in visibility. Most people are surprised to know there's 300 ports across the nation, either coastal or inland ports. And they are critical to the nation's economy. So the American Society of Civil Engineers has been doing a series of economic studies for over 10 years, kind of looking at what's infrastructure's role on the economy. And we found that kind of gradually deteriorating, unreliable infrastructure has this drag. And it equates to about $3,300 a year for the average American household. And we know ports are this critical piece to driving our economy. They're a quarter of the nation's overall GDP. My colleague Cary at AAPA has some great stats on the jobs that they produce. 30 million jobs, in fact, I think they estimated in 2018. So, and I think the other thing that makes them such a critical piece of the economy is they thrive in their ability to handle a variety of goods. So whether it's bulk goods, agriculture, manufactured equipment, you name it, it's either coming in or going out through a port.
A lot of big impact it has. And Cary, your association represents ports across the Americas. And in many ways, we're in competition here in this hemisphere with the economic power of Asia or Europe or other parts of the world. Tell us how important the maritime system is to our overall competitiveness, the competitiveness of producers here in the United States.
Mark, thank you for the question. Emily, it's great to join you, and thank you for all the work that ASCE does, raising attention and ultimately funding for our transportation infrastructure system, because it's great to talk about these things, but I really feel like we're making a difference when Congress ups its game or the president ups her or his game to commit resources to modernizing our infrastructure and making it better suited for the modern economy and superpower that the United States is. So that's a decent jumping off point in terms of superpower. There was a great book by a professor, Peter Zahan, who's now making a lot more headlines talking about the rise of China and his skepticism of the rise of China. But he wrote The Accidental Superpower, 15 years ago. And he keyed in on how the navigable waterways of the United States were part and parcel of its rise to being a global trading and military superpower from the 1700s on. And that's kind of what I premise my entire understanding of our ports and maritime supply chain relative to the rest of the world. We're doing some research now at AAPA, which, as you mentioned, represents all of the ports of the Western Hemisphere. And we're looking at how some of our trading competitors including the European bloc, Southeast Asian countries, even African countries, surprisingly, and how all of them, Canada, how all of them are spending comparable, if not greater, percentages of their national budgets on their port system. The bipartisan infrastructure law and recent congressional action really was a good boost to get us on par with how our trading competitors are modernizing their transportation systems. But we have our heads in the sand or underwater, if you want a silly pun, if we thought that our system was the best and our investments were the greatest, because they're not.
We have some work to do. And when we think about that system of transportation, we've been talking about ports, but Emily, there's an intermodal system of transportation that is vital to making everything work. And in this post-COVID surge of e-commerce, that's putting whole new stresses on that system. Please explain how it all fits together, the intermodal system, the transportation network.
Sure. Well, you're exactly right that it's a system of systems. And the other thing that the civil engineers are known for, I mentioned our economic study, but we've put out this report card every 4 years since 1998, in fact. And we look at infrastructure a little bit in these silos. You know, we have up to 17 categories. But we really did stress in the ports chapter that, you know, it's only as strong as the weakest link, right? You've got this whole intermodal system. And I'll start with the good news for ports. In 2021, the last year we put out a report card, ports came in at a B minus. We saw really good investments from ports across the country in their own systems, seeing the new demands on the supply chain. They knew they had to upgrade, you know, terminals, facilities, et cetera. A lot of good investment taking place, a lot of modernization, a lot of efforts to boost resilience. Here's the other piece, though. Roads came in at a grade of D. So I'm a mom, I'm a parent. I would not be thrilled if my child brought home a D, right? We have a lot of work to do. And just to give one example, the roads that connect to the ports, 9% of intermodal connector pavement, those roadways are in good or very good condition, just 9%. So if, you know, the terminals are operating like clockwork, but then you get to the road and it's full of potholes, we have a problem there. Rail is the other part of the system where they have a good grade according to the report card, freight rail, but we know lots of needs there as well. You know, improvements needed for on-dock rail. And it looks like about half of the total container terminals at U.S. ports had on-dock rail access as of 2019. So we know it's all interconnected. It all needs to be moving together for this system to work well and for us to be competitive, as Cary mentioned.
And Cary, in order to make this very complex system work well together, when it has a dozen different federal agencies engaged in different pieces of this, a national freight strategy is essential. And given the changes that have happened with more e-commerce and the pressures that puts on that and the increased competitiveness globally, what kind of new national freight strategy do we need, and what are the key elements that should address?
I think there are a lot of folks in our industry of port shipping and supply chain, TDL, we sometimes call it transport, distribution, and logistics, that they incorrectly think that we don't have a national freight strategy. We do, as you probably know well, Mark. The problem in my biased eyes is that the last national freight strategy mentioned ports about half a dozen times in a 150-page document. So it did not take the major freight gateways seriously. It was not a serious strategy. So it might sound silly, but a little more equal time to all the modalities of transport would probably serve us well in the next round of national freight planning. I've got to step back and say, you pointed out e-commerce. We've been talking through the first round of questions about reaching sort of the end of the useful life of a lot of the infrastructure that was built. in the middle of the 20th century. So why do we need to revitalize it? Well, not only because it's reaching its end of its useful life, but the U.S. Department of Transportation itself estimates that national freight will grow about 50% between now and 2050. So those are huge growth numbers in the amount of trade and freight traffic moving around the system. So yet another reason why we need a national freight strategy. I really wish I could bottle up what Emily was saying about intermodal connections, because that's the view of ports as well. Ports themselves, within the gate, we sometimes say, they're functioning fine. Yeah, you get blips like the labor strife that's playing out on the West Coast right now. But operationally, they're doing quite well. And we moved more freight than ever over the course of the pandemic through our ports. It's where the rail meets the dock, or where the truck meets the rail yard. You get the idea. It's where the intermodal seams occur, where a lot of the freight bottlenecks happen. So a lot more focus on investments at those transfer points and operational decision making, including better information sharing across the modes when the two modalities are meeting at these seams, should help our system a lot over the medium and longer term. My last note on this is we need and will achieve a much greener, cleaner, and more resilient freight transportation network through investments that will modernize the system and ultimately, over time, in a realistic way, decarbonize the way that we do business in transportation.
A lot of good reasons why we need to have an updated national freight strategy. You mentioned a bit about the digital, Cary, but Emily, tell us about technology. It's transforming every aspect of our lives. Clearly, it's impacting maritime commerce. How do you see technology allowing for a more efficient, a more resilient maritime system?
Sure, another good question. And I think you're seeing a lot of exciting developments in the ports world when it comes to embracing technology. And obviously, reducing shipping costs, reducing shipping time, all things that technology can enable. And Cary would probably be an expert on this as well. But, some of the things that we're hearing about that are exciting in the ports industry relate to kind of advanced analytics, when you can use historical and current data to make better predictions about your needs, be more responsive and adaptive and resilient in real time. That's all helping to reduce costs and kind of optimize efficiency. We were fortunate enough, we had our convention in Anaheim last year and got to take a little field trip to the Port of Long Beach and see their automated terminal. And I was just blown away. I mean, these facilities are like mini cities, mini ecosystems. So many components have to work together, from the cranes on down, and just watching that play out, watching just the sophistication of the system. I think, I don't want to sound biased. I love all the infrastructure categories, but I think some of the others could learn a lot from watching that port operations. And it's in the business interest, right, to use technology to make things as efficiently as possible. So we're looking forward to perhaps seeing some other examples of semi-automated terminals, automated terminals, intelligent transportation systems, all of that to help keep us competitive moving forward.
Great. And Cary, Emily just mentioned that some ports are partially automated or automated. When you look globally, U.S. is not leading in terms of adapting automation in ports. What do you see for the future of embracing the power of technology to make the whole system more efficient, more resilient?
You're right that the U.S. is not leading when it comes to technology and automation in port operations. There's no doubt about that. But I've got a level set with something that will probably surprise you. It surprised me. Only about 4 or 5% of all port terminals worldwide have any level any amount of automation built into their machinery or their operations. So it's not as widespread as maybe the futurists in the Wall Street Journal technology section might have you believe. That isn't to say the technology doesn't exist and that we shouldn't move towards it. I just want to level set where the US exists in the grand scheme of things. So actually, if you were to compare the amount of terminals in the US with those of countries around the world, we're actually on par with the amount of automation that we have in our ports, but we're not a leader. So, of course, I have to address the elephant in the room, which is, of course, we have robust unions that are still working at many of our ports, and they are deeply cautious and skeptical of automation of port operations. We can't forego progress because of that. Imagine if we were still working with hooks and wheelbarrows at our ports like we were only 40, 50, 60 years ago prior to containerization. And yes, containerization only happened about 40 years ago. So technology, just putting out all this in the grand scheme and the timeline of history, technology has been slow on the uptake at ports. Efficiency, resilience, and decarbonization all require more technology adoption. I really like to talk about these as cobots. In most cases, these are just machines that work with people to make their jobs easier and to make them more productive and to make them safer. So I mentioned 40, 50, 60 years ago, it's a sad reality that there were thousands of casualties on the docks across the country because of lack of machinery that made our job safer. And that's down to negligible numbers. It still happens tragically, but negligible numbers of casualties at our ports across the country because of technology and safety. What my final point that I just learned from a technologist who's been in this industry, I only learned it this week. He's been in this industry 20 plus years, and he estimates only 1% of jobs at ports will fundamentally change because of technology and automation. 99% of them will change marginally. The amount of time you spend on your feet, the amount of time you have to keep your eyes open. Only 1% of jobs are going to truly require reskilling in a different way. So I just try to put a little bit of that in perspective for you.
And we also talked at our roundtable about the importance of that human capital and the need to continue to invest, not just in technology, but also keeping the talented people that are making the ports and the whole system work.
Amen.
Indeed. Emily, greener. Cary mentioned we're also trying to make things greener. A lot of opportunities we talked about that if you are transporting by a combination of ship and rail, it's a lot greener than if you just transport by road. But there's a number of ways that the maritime system is trying to make sure that it's more environmental friendly. Tell us about some of those.
Sure. It's such an important issue, and I think a renewed focus on some of these issues with recent legislation that Cary had already mentioned. We have the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, and I think a recognition that communities surrounding these ports are impacted, right? We were just talking before about some of the air pollution from wildfires. There's also growing concern and acknowledgement that we want the air to be clean around the ports as well. Some exciting competitive grant programs available now through legislation for ports to start to tackle some of these issues, to innovate, to pioneer some new strategies. One that we're kind of following is the Port Infrastructure Development Program, has a little over $2 billion over 5 years. And ports could access this funds in a number of ways. It could be worker training to support electrification, EV charging, tackling some of the issues with truck pollution by supporting zero emission trucks. That's a big piece of the puzzle as well. But also hearing about, perhaps there's other equipment within the port that could be electrified. So tractors, container stacks, forklifts, cranes, all these pieces of the puzzle where we can slowly, incrementally lower emissions in that ecosystem I mentioned of ports. Also within the federal highway program, there's a reduction of truck emissions at port facilities program. That's 400 million over 5 years, not chump change there. You can use that for advancing port electrification, looking at those heavy duty commercial vehicles, kind of all of the above. These projects will be eligible. And then within the Inflation Reduction Act, we were really pleased to see $3 billion for zero emission port equipment and climate action plans. So I think a heavy emphasis on this with the current administration, but also kind of cuts across both sides of the aisle, that there's ways, again, to lower emissions and improve efficiency at the same time.
And you add all those efficiency enhancing measures within ports, with the ships themselves looking to move towards carbon friendly fuels, and I think there's a great future.
Right, exactly.
Now, Cary, for our last question, we also talked about cybersecurity and resilience and globally needing to have free and open commerce and some concerns that were raised there. Please share with us what you think our priorities ought to be in order to ensure that there's a free and open commerce globally, not just in the hemisphere.
Much of what we've talked about in this powwow already intersects with the vulnerabilities that are created by IT and OT systems that are becoming more expanded in the way we run our transportation networks. So I've got to level set again. The threat is huge. Since the beginning of the pandemic, when much of our economy went remote and much of it has remained that way, we've seen a 400% increase in attempted cyber attacks at seaports, full stop. So the numbers jumped. Being critical infrastructure, seaports are in the crosshairs of bad actors, full stop. Because of all the commerce that's happening, the amount of commercial data that can be exploited that's moving through a port is a juicy target, full stop. So the environment we're in is full of threats. Customs fluidity really depends on more technology, machine learning, data sharing across all of the actors in the supply chain and transportation network. But we're starting to see a cliff form with shortfalls in funding our customs and border operations at our ports of entry on the land side, air side, and on the maritime side. So I would, for any policymakers out there, I would strongly recommend taking a look at whether our customs processors have the resources they need to accommodate 50% growth in goods over the coming decades, because even right now we're starting to see a shortfall. But I do think that greasing the skids for trade in and of itself makes America a better place to do business. I mentioned to Emily and to you, Mark, I was in Halifax, Nova Scotia, a great maritime trading region of our world in Canada, and the recent wildfires had started there. But as I was leaving Halifax, all of the customs processing for me and my other business and policy partners were processed on the Canadian side of the border, and it made it very seamless for us to get back to the US. And we all said, well, we'd love to come back to Canada and do business. So maybe a cute anecdote, but if people doing trade in goods, commodities, retail, what have you, also have that same experience, they see America as a great place to do business.
We need to make sure it is a great place to do business. And as we've been describing, the efficiency, the resilience of the maritime system, whether you're a consumer, the prices you're going to pay, or a producer that wants to export your goods around the world, is important. It's important to our security. So many reasons why we really need to know more, to focus more on the maritime system. And I'm thrilled to have with me Cary Davis from the Port Authorities Emily Feenstra from the Civil Engineers. I'm Mark Kennedy with the Wahba Institute and Strategic Competition here at the Wilson Center. Thanks for joining us today.